The massive chamber was filled with beings from across the galaxy, and Rachel Morrison walked through the entrance with her head held high and her hands steady at her sides, and she could feel hundreds of eyes watching her from every direction. And some of those eyes belonged to creatures she had only seen in photographs and briefing materials back on Earth, and the air smelled strange and metallic, and she could hear the hum of translation devices all around her as delegates whispered to each other in their native languages, and the sound created an odd buzzing that made her ears ring slightly, but she pushed the discomfort aside and focused on walking forward without showing any sign of nervousness or fear, because she knew that every step she took was being judged and analyzed by species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. While humans had barely left their own solar system, the council chamber itself was a marvel of engineering and architecture. And it stretched so far that Rachel could barely see the opposite wall, and the ceiling rose up into darkness that sparkled with what looked like stars, but were actually some kind of advanced lighting system, and the floor beneath her boots was made of black stone so perfectly polished that she could see her reflection in it, and the walls were carved with symbols and writing in languages that predated human civilization by millions of years, and everywhere she looked there were beings that defied easy description, and some floated in the air without any visible means of support, and some were covered in scales or fur or what looked like living metal, and some were so alien that Rachel struggled to figure out which end was the front and which was the back. At the highest point of the chamber sat Counselor Vela, and she was an elf woman with features so perfect they looked like they had been carved by a master sculptor, and her skin was pale like moonlight, and her hair fell down her back in waves of pure silver, and her eyes were violet and seemed to glow with an inner light, and she wore robes that shimmered and changed the color as she moved, and around her neck was a pendant that contained what looked like a miniature galaxy spinning slowly, and she sat in a throne that was carved from a single massive crystal, and she looked down at Rachel with an expression that was hard to read, but seemed to contain a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been pity or perhaps contemptual. Reached the center of the chamber and stopped on a circular platform that was slightly raised from the floor, and immediately holographic displays appeared all around her, showing data and images and text in dozens of languages, and she recognized some of the images as pictures of Earth and Mars and the Moon and the small collection of space stations that humanity had managed to build in the last 50 years, and next to those images were numbers and charts and graphs that showed humanity's technological capabilities compared to other species in the galaxy, and the comparison was not flattering, and most of the numbers were highlighted in red, which she assumed meant they were below acceptable standards. Vela spoke, and her voice was beautiful and musical, but there was also something cold in it, like the sound of wind blowing across ice, and she said that humanity had requested membership in the Galactic Council, and that the request had been reviewed by the appropriate committees and subcommittees and working groups, and that a decision had been reached. And Rachel stood perfectly still and kept her breathing steady and waited for the verdict, even though she already knew it would not be good. Because if it had been good, she would have been told privately rather than summoned to this public chamber in front of hundreds of witnesses. The elf woman continued speaking, and she listed all the ways in which humanity was deficient, and she said that humans lacked faster than light travel technology, and that their energy production was limited to their home planet and a few nearby facilities, and that their medical science was primitive compared to species that had conquered death itself, and that their military capabilities were laughable compared to civilizations that could destroy stars with their weapons, and that their social structures were chaotic and prone to conflict and violence, and that their economic systems were inefficient and wasteful, and that their cultural achievements were derivative and unimpressive, and with each criticism, the holographic displays changed to show more data and more comparisons and more evidence of human inadequacy. Then another council member spoke, and this one was a being made of crystal that reflected light in dazzling patterns, and its voice sounded like wind chimes, and it said that humanity's biggest problem is not their lack of technology, but their violent nature, and it brought up images from Earth's history showing wars and battles and conflicts that had killed millions and it showed environmental damage and pollution and species extinctions, and it painted a picture of humanity as a young and dangerous species that could not be trusted with the responsibilities of galactic citizenship. Rachel wanted to argue and defend her species, but she had been instructed to remain silent during the initial presentation, and so she stood there and watched as her people were judged and found wanting by beings who had never set foot on Earth and had never met a human before today, except through reports and data files, and she felt anger building in her chest, but she pushed it down, because losing her temper now would only confirm everything they were saying about human volatility and violence. Then Commander Lysis stood up, and she was a gray, and she looked almost human, except for her enormous dark eyes that had no visible pupils, and her skin was smooth and gray, and her body was thin and delicate looking, and she wore a uniform that seemed to be made of living technology because it shifted and changed as she moved, and she floated down from her seat to a speaking platform without using any visible means of propulsion, and when she spoke, her voice was high and clear, and she said that the Gray Collective had studied humanity extensively, and that they had concluded that humans were not ready for council membership and might never be ready, because violence was so deeply embedded in human nature that it could not be separated from who they were as a species. Lisa continued, and she brought up more examples, and she showed footage of human soldiers in combat and human criminals committing terrible acts, and human protesters fighting in the streets, and human leaders making decisions that led to suffering and death. And she said that every civilization went through growing pains, but humanity's growing pains were more severe than most, and that allowing such a violent species into the council would be dangerous, not just for other species, but for humans themselves, because they might do something reckless that would lead to their own destruction. And other council members nodded in agreement, and some made sounds that Rachel's translation device converted into expressions of support and concern, and she realized that this was not just a judgment but a performance, and that the decision had already been made before she ever walked into the chamber, and that she was here simply so that the council could say they had given humanity a fair hearing before rejecting them or placing them in some kind of restricted status that would limit their ability to participate in galactic affairs. Finally, Vela raised one elegant hand, and the chamber fell silent immediately. She said that while humanity had many flaws and deficiencies, galactic law required that they be offered some form of membership because they had developed space travel and had made contact with other species and had requested to join the galactic community, and therefore they could not be completely rejected, but they also could not be given full membership rights because they had not demonstrated the maturity and capability necessary for such responsibility. The elf woman explained that humanity would be placed in the lowest tier of membership, and that their votes in council matters would carry almost no weight, and that their trading rights would be severely restricted, and that they would only be allowed to travel through certain approved corridors of space, and that they would have no representation on any important committees or working groups, and that they would essentially be members in name only until they could prove themselves worthy of elevation to higher status. And she made it clear that such elevation might take centuries or even millennia, because change happens slowly in the galaxy, and species that rushed forward too quickly often destroyed themselves. Rachel listened to all of this, and she felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, and she thought about all the people back on Earth who had worked so hard to make this moment possible, and all the resources that had been poured into the space program, and all the hopes and dreams that rested on her shoulders. And she knew that if she went back with this news, it would be devastating, and that many people would see it as confirmation that humanity should just stay home and focus on solving their own problems rather than reaching for the stars. But then something shifted inside her, and she remembered why she had volunteered for this mission in the first place, and she remembered all the times in human history when people had been told they were not good enough or smart enough or worthy enough, and she remembered how those people had proven their critics wrong through determination and hard work and clever thinking, and she realized that maybe this was not the end, but the beginning, and that maybe the council had just given her an opportunity, even if they did not realize it. So, When Vela finished speaking and asked if Rachel had anything to say, Rachel took a deep breath and stepped forward, and said that she accepted the terms on behalf of humanity, but that she wanted to propose an alternative arrangement, and the chamber erupted in surprise because apparently humans were supposed to accept their judgment meekly and gratefully and not suggest change as commander. Lysa stared at Rachel with those enormous black eyes, and her expression was difficult to read. But Rachel thought she detected surprise, and maybe a hint of respect, or perhaps it was annoyance, and the Grey Woman said that humans were in no position to negotiate, because they had nothing to offer and no leverage to use, and Rachel could hear other delegates making similar comments in their various languages, and the translation devices worked over time to convert all the different sounds into something she could understand. Rachel stood perfectly still and waited for the noise to die down, and she kept her expression neutral, even though her heart was pounding and her palms were sweating inside her gloves, and she had practiced this moment 100 times back on Earth, but actually standing here in front of hundreds of alien species was completely different from practicing in a simulation, and she wondered if she was about to make a terrible mistake that would doom humanity's chances forever. But she pushed the doubt aside because it was too late to back down. Now when the chamber finally quieted down, Rachel spoke again, and she said she was not trying to negotiate, but rather offering the council a choice, and she explained that the council clearly viewed humanity as primitive and violent and incapable of contributing anything valuable to galactic civilization, and that if those assessments were correct, then the restrictions, which made sense, but if there was even a small chance that the council was wrong, then maybe they should test their assumptions before making a final judgment. Vela leaned forward slightly in her throne, and her violet eyes seemed to pierce right through Rachel, and she asked what kind of test Rachel had in mind, and Rachel could tell that the elf woman was interested despite herself, and that maybe this was not the first time someone had challenged the council's authority. But it was probably the first time a human had done it. Rachel took another deep breath and said that the council should give humanity one problem to solve, and it could be any problem that the council had been unable to solve themselves, and humanity would have 6 months to find a solution, and if humans failed, then they would accept all the restrictions without complaint and would not ask for reconsideration for at least 100 years, but if humans succeeded, then humanity would receive full membership with all standard rights and privileges. The chamber exploded into chaos, and delegates were shouting and arguing and making sounds that ranged from clicking to buzzing to what sounded like musical notes, and some were clearly outraged at the audacity of this proposal, while others seemed intrigued, and a few even appeared to be laughing. Although Rachel was not sure if alien laughter sounded anything like human laughter, one delegate, who looked like a giant insect with multiple arms, stood up and said that this was ridiculous because humanity has already been evaluated by the best scientific and sociological experts in the galaxy, and those experts had reached clear conclusions, and there was no need to waste time on pointless tests, and several other delegates voiced agreement, and Rachel felt her hope beginning to fade. But then Vela raised her hand again, and silence returned almost instantly, and Rachel realized that the elf woman must have enormous authority and respect within the council, because everyone obeyed her immediately without question, and Vela said that she found the proposal interesting, and that perhaps it would be educational for humanity to learn just how far they had to go before they could compete with established galactic civilizations. Commander Lysa floated back down to her speaking platform and said that if the council was seriously considering this proposal, then the challenge should be something truly difficult and not some simple task that humans might solve through luck, and she suggested that they should be required to do something that would demonstrate both technological capability and strategic thinking and cultural maturity. Council members offered suggestions, and one wanted humans to solve a mathematical equation that had stumped the best minds in the galaxy for centuries, and another wanted them to negotiate peace between two warring species, and another wanted them to develop a new form of faster-than-light travel, and the suggestions kept coming, and Rachel listened to all of them and tried not to show her growing concern because some of these challenges seemed completely impossible. Finally, Vela spoke again, and she said that she had decided on the appropriate challenge, and the chamber fell silent once more, and the elf woman explained that for 70 years the council had been trying to locate The homeworld of the Wraith Raiders and these pirates had attacked hundreds of ships and destroyed dozens of colonies and killed thousands of beings from many different species, and they struck without warning and disappeared without trace. And the Council had sent their best hunters and trackers and military forces, but no one had ever found where the raiders came from or where they went after their attacks. Rachel felt her stomach drop because she knew about the Wraith Raiders, and everyone in human space knew about them because they had attacked human ships too, and they were considered one of the most dangerous threats in the galaxy. And no one had any idea how to stop them, and now the Council was asking humans to do in 6 months what the galaxy's greatest civilizations had failed to do in 70 years. Vela continued, and she said that humanity would be given access to all existing data on the raids and all the intelligence reports and all the failed tracking attempts. And they could use any methods they wanted and consult with any experts they chose, but they had to find the Raider homeworld within 6 months or accept permanent placement in the lowest tier of Council membership. Rachel wanted to ask for time to consult with her superiors back on Earth, but she knew that showing any hesitation now would be seen as weakness and would undermine everything she had just said about human confidence and capability. So instead she looked directly at Vela and said that humanity accepted the challenge and that they would find the Wraith Raiders within the allotted time. The elf woman smiled slightly, and it was not a warm smile, but rather one that suggested she expected to be proven right about human inadequacy very soon, and she said that Rachel's time began immediately, that the clock was already running, and Rachel realized that she had just committed humanity to an impossible task with only 6 months to succeed or fail. Rachel left the Council chamber and made her way back to the human embassy, which was a small building in the diplomatic quarter that looked shabby compared to the massive structures that housed representatives from older and more established species. And as soon as she was inside and in a secure room, she activated the quantum communication link to Earth and waited for the connection to establish Director Jennifer. Hayes appeared on the screen, and she was the head of the newly formed Coordination Center. That was supposed to manage humanity's relationship with the galactic community, and she was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she had been watching the entire council session through the video feed that Rachel had been transmitting. And before Rachel could say anything, Jennifer said that she had seen everything and that teams were already being assembled to work on the problem. Rachel felt a wave of relief wash over her because she had been afraid that people back home would be angry at her for making such a bold proposal without authorization. But Jennifer just smiled and said that the Coordination Center had been hoping Rachel would do something exactly like this, because accepting the Council's restrictions would have been a disaster for human morale, and at least this way they had a chance to prove themselves. Jennifer explained that she had already contacted every major space agency and research institution and military organization on Earth, and that volunteers were flooding in from every country, and that people were excited and energized by the challenge rather than discouraged. And Rachel realized that maybe she had read the human response correctly. After all, the director said that they had some advantages that the Council might not have considered, and Rachel asked what those advantages were, and Jennifer said that humans were really good at finding people who did not want to be found because they had been doing it to each other for thousands of years, and that human law enforcement and intelligence agencies had developed techniques and technologies specifically designed to track criminals and terrorists and fugitives who went to great lengths to hide themselves. Thought about this and realized it made sense because most alien species seemed to rely heavily on advanced technology and logical analysis, but humans had learned to think like their prey and to anticipate irrational behavior and to look for patterns that did not make obvious sense, and maybe those skills would be useful in finding pirates who had successfully evaded every conventional tracking method. Over the next few days, data began pouring in from the Council archives, and there was information about every single Wraith Raider attack for the past 70 years, including dates and locations and target types and casualties and damage, reports and witness testimonies and sensor readings and everything that had been collected, and the amount of information was staggering, and Rachel knew that human analysts would need weeks just to process it all. But Jennifer had assembled a team of specialists from various fields, and they worked around the clock, reviewing the data and looking for patterns and anomalies. And Rachel watched as they created charts and graphs and models and simulations, and they approached the problem from every possible angle, including some that apparently had never occurred to the Council's investigators. One team focused on the tactical aspects of the raids and tried to figure out what kind of ships and weapons the raiders were using and how they coordinated their attacks, and another team analyzed the economic impact and tried to determine what the raiders were stealing and why, and another team studied the psychological profiles of known pirates from other species to see if there were common patterns in how criminals thought and operated. Progress was slow and frustrating because the Wraith Raiders were extremely good at covering their tracks, and they never left survivors who could provide detailed information, and they never took credit for their attacks or made demands or communicated with anyone. And they seemed to strike randomly without any discernible pattern. And after 2 months of intensive analysis, the teams had made very little progress. Rachel started to worry that she had made a terrible mistake and that humanity would fail this challenge and be stuck in the lowest tier of council membership forever, and she could see the same concern in Jennifer's eyes during their daily video calls, and morale among the research teams was starting to decline as people realized just how difficult this problem really was. Rachel sat in her office at the embassy and stared at the reports on her desk, and none of them contained good news, and the various teams had been working for 3 months now. And they had plenty of theories, but no concrete evidence, and nothing that would lead them to the Raider homeworld, and she wondered how she would face the council when the 6 months were up, and she had to admit that humanity had failed. Jennifer had tried to remain optimistic during their calls, but even she was starting to sound discouraged. And she admitted that maybe the problem really was impossible, and that 70 years was not enough time for the council to solve it, because maybe it needed 100 years or 200 years, and Rachel appreciated the attempt to make her feel better, but it did not really help then. One morning, Rachel received a message marked urgent from the coordination center, and she opened it immediately expecting bad news, but instead it was a request for a video conference with someone named Lisa Webb, and Rachel had never heard that name before, and when she asked Jennifer who this person was, the director smiled for the first time in weeks and said that Lisa might have found something. The video connection opened, and Rachel saw a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore casual clothes rather than any kind of uniform, and she had the tired but excited look of someone who had been working all night and had just discovered something important. Lisa introduced herself and said that she was not actually part of any official research team, and that she was a civilian contractor who had been hired to help with data analysis, and that her background was in law enforcement rather than space exploration or military intelligence, and specifically, she had spent 20 years working as a detective specializing in financial crimes and tracking money laundering operations. Akio asked what financial crimes had to do with space pirates, and Lisa said that was exactly the right question, and that most people had been approaching the problem from a military or technological perspective. But she had decided to approach it from an economic perspective instead, and she had started looking at the raids not as random attacks but as business operations, with costs and benefits and supply chains and markets. The detective explained that she had noticed something strange about the pattern of attacks, and it was not about where the raiders struck, but about what happened after they struck, and specifically, she had been looking at how trade routes changed in response to each attack, and how shipping companies rerouted their vessels to avoid dangerous areas, and how insurance rates fluctuated in different regions of space. At first, Rachel did not understand why any of this mattered, but Lisa continued, and she said that every time the raiders attacked a specific location, the commercial traffic in that area decreased significantly, and ships started using alternate routes to avoid the danger zone. And this seemed obvious and expected, but what was interesting was how those changes created ripple effects throughout the entire regional economy. Issa brought up a holographic display showing trade routes across a section of the galaxy, and Rachel could see the main shipping lanes as bright lines connecting various star systems, and then Lisa overlaid the locations of raider attacks, and Rachel all that they were mostly concentrated along the busiest routes, which made sense because that was where the most valuable cargo would be. But then Lisa showed what happened after each attack, and Rachel watched as the bright lines shifted and moved like water, flowing around rocks, and new routes formed and old routes faded, and the entire pattern of commerce changed in response to the threat. And Lisa said that these changes were not random but followed predictable mathematical patterns based on factors like fuel costs and travel time and risk assessment. The detective then brought up another layer of data, and this one showed gravitational readings from various regions of space. And she explained that when large numbers of ships out through an area, they created measurable gravitational effects, because even though individual ships were small, when you had hundreds or thousands of them using the same corridor, the cumulative mass was significant enough to be detected by sensitive instruments. Rachel started to understand where this was going, and Lisa confirmed her suspicion by saying that the shifts in trade routes caused by raider attacks created corresponding shifts in gravitational patterns, and those shifts created ripples that spread outward, like waves in a pond. And most investigators had dismissed these gravitational anomalies as irrelevant because they were just side effects of normal commerce. But Lisa had noticed something interesting, and she had plotted all the gravitational readings over the 70-year period, and she had used some advanced mathematical modeling to filter out the normal patterns. And when she did that, she found something unexpected. And there was one region of space where the gravitational readings showed consistent anomalies that did not match the traffic patterns. She explained that this region was not on any major trade route, and very few ships ever went there because there was nothing of interest in that area according to the official star charts. And the gravitational anomalies had always been attributed to measurement errors or instrument malfunctions, but Lisa thought there might be another explanation. The detective said that if you assumed the raiders were hiding in that region, then everything made sense, because their attacks created traffic pattern changes that generated gravitational ripples, and those ripples helped to mask the gravitational signature of the raider fleet itself. And it was like hiding in the noise of a crowd where individual voices disappeared into the general din. Lisa had taken her theory to several astrophysicists and asked them to calculate what kind of gravitational signature a fleet of several hundred ships would create if they were all clustered in a small region of space, and the numbers matched the anomalies had found. And then she had asked them what kind of celestial object could exist in that region without being on any star charts, and they had suggested a brown dwarf or a hidden dwarf star. Rachel felt her heart racing because this was the first real lead anyone had found in 3 months, and she asked Lisa if she was certain about this. And the detective said she was not certain, but she was confident enough to recommend that they send a probe to investigate, and that if she was wrong, they would have wasted some time and resources, but if she was right, they would have found the raider homeworld. Jennifer authorized the probe immediately, and they used one of the council's stealth reconnaissance drones because human technology was not advanced enough for this kind of mission, and the probe would take several days to reach the target region because it had to travel carefully to avoid detection, and everyone waited anxiously for the results. Rachel tried to manage her expectations because she had been disappointed too many times already, but she could not help feeling hopeful, and she thought about how Lisa had approached the problem from a completely different angle than everyone else, and how she had used skills developed on Earth solving human crimes to tackle a galactic mystery. The probe finally reached the target region and began sending back data. And at first there was nothing unusual, and Rachel felt her hope beginning to fade again. But then the probe detected something, and it was exactly what Lisa had predicted, and there was a small brown dwarf star that was not on any official charts, and it was surrounded by a debris field that provided natural cover, and hiding among the debris were hundreds of ships. Images came through, and Rachel stared at them in amazement because there were raider vessels of all different sizes and configurations, and there were also what looked like supply ships and repair facilities and even some kind of space station. And this was not just a hiding place, but a full functioning base where the raiders lived and worked and planned their attacks. Jennifer immediately contacted Rachel and said that they needed to inform the council right away, and Rachel agreed, but she also felt nervous because they still had almost 4 weeks left before the deadline, and she wondered if they should wait and gather more information to make absolutely sure they were right. But Jennifer said no, because if word leaked out, somehow the raiders might flee, and then humanity would lose its chance to prove itself. Rekel requested an emergency session of the council, and Vela granted the request, though the elf woman sounded skeptical. When she asked if humanity had actually found something, or if this was just a desperate attempt to buy more time, and Rachel said that she had found the raider homeworld and that she had proof, the council chamber filled up quickly, because word had spread that the humans were making some kind of announcement, and many delegates clearly expected to witness humanity's humiliating admission of failure, and Rachel could see the smug expressions on some of their faces and the pitying looks on others. She walked to the center platform again. It's just like she had 3 months earlier, and this time she carried a data chip that contained all of Lisa's research and all the probe's findings, and she uploaded the data to the council systems, and holographic displays appeared showing trade route, apps, and gravitational readings and mathematical models, and finally, the images of the hidden raider base. The chamber went completely silent, and Rachel could see shock and disbelief on the faces of delegates who had been certain that humans would fail, and she explained how Lisa had approached the problem from an economic perspective rather than a military one, and how she had found patterns that everyone else had missed because they were looking in the wrong places with the wrong assumptions. Commander Lisa was the first to speak, and she said that the data needed to be verified, and that just because the probe had found some ships in an unmapped region did not necessarily mean they were the Wraith Raiders, and Rachel had expected this objection. And she said that the council was welcome to send their own investigators to confirm the findings. Vela studied the data for a long time without saying anything, and her expression was unreadable, and finally she said that she would authorize an immediate verification mission using council security forces, and that if the location was confirmed to be the Raider homeworld, then humanity would have succeeded in the challenge. The next 2 days were agonizing because Rachel knew that everything depended on what the verification team found, and she tried to stay busy, but mostly she just paced around the embassy and checked for updates every few minutes, and Jennifer called several times to ask if there was any news, and Rachel had to keep saying, "Not yet." Finally, Vela summoned Rachel back to the council chamber, and this time Commander Lisa was standing next to the elf woman on the high platform, and the gray woman looked shaken and tired. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, and she said that the verification team had confirmed the location and had positively identified multiple Wraith Raider vessels, and that council's security forces were preparing to launch a major operation to neutralize the threat. Vela looked at Rachel, and for the first time there was genuine respect in those violet eyes, and she said that humanity had succeeded where the galaxy's finest had failed for 70 years, and that the council had been wrong to underestimate humans, and that perhaps youth and inexperience were not always disadvantages. Council chamber was packed with even more delegates than before, and Rachel noticed that many of them were whispering and pointing at her as she walked to the center platform, and the atmosphere was completely different from her first appearance, and instead of contempt and dismissal, she sensed curiosity and even a degree of nervousness, and she realized that humanity had changed its status in galactic politics overnight. Vela stood from her crystal throne and descended the steps to the main floor, and this was unprecedented because council members of her rank never left their elevated positions, and Rachel felt her pulse quicken as the elf woman approached. And when they were face to face, Vela extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, and Rachel shook it, feeling the cool, smooth skin that was nothing like human flesh. The elf woman spoke, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber without any technological amplification, and she said that the council had completed its verification, and that the hidden base contained over 300 Raider vessels, along with support infrastructure and captured cargo worth billions in galactic currency, and that preliminary analysis suggested this had been the Raiders' primary base of operations for at least 40 years. Vela continued, and she said that council security forces had launched a coordinated strike using the intelligence that humanity had provided, and that they had captured or destroyed most of the Raider fleet, and that the threat, which had plagued the galaxy for 7 decades, had been effectively neutralized, and that hundreds of species owed humanity a debt of gratitude for solving a problem that had seemed unsolvable. Commander Lisa approached as well, and Rachel could see that. The gray woman's enormous dark eyes held something different now, and it was not the suspicion and wariness from before, but rather a kind of cautious admiration. And Lisa said that the Gray Collective wanted to formally apologize for their earlier assessment of humanity, and that they had been wrong to judge humans so harshly based on incomplete information. The commander explained that she had reviewed all of Lisa's research personally, and that the approach was brilliant in its simplicity, and that the collective's own investigators had been using the most advanced tracking technology and mathematical models, but had never thought to look at the economic side effects of the raids, because that seemed to indirect and too far removed from the actual problem. Rachel thanked her for the apology, said that humans had their own blind spots and limitations, and that they had simply been lucky that this particular problem happened to align with human strengths, and that there would be many other challenges where human methods would not work as well, and where they would need to learn from the more experienced species. But Lisa shook her head and said it was not just luck, and that what humans had done demonstrated a different way of thinking that the Council needed. And she explained that most galactic civilizations were very old and very stable, and that they approached problems with centuries of accumulated wisdom and proven methods, but sometimes that wisdom became rigid and those proven methods became the only methods anyone considered. The Gray Woman said that humans were young and chaotic and unproven, and that they did not have centuries of tradition telling them how things should be done, and that this meant they were free to try approaches that older species would dismiss as unconventional or inefficient, and that sometimes those unconventional approaches worked better than the traditional ones. Other delegates began to speak up, and many of them thanked Rachel personally and told her about friends or family members who had been killed by the raiders, or cargo that had been stolen, or colonies that had been attacked. And Rachel had not fully understood the scope of the raider problem until now, and she realized that this had affected virtually every species in the galaxy in some way. One delegate was from a species called the Valeri, and she was a being made of semi-solid energy contained in a shimmering field, and she said that the daughter had been killed in a raider attack 15 years ago, and that she had given up hope of ever seeing justice, and that she wanted to meet this Lisa Webb person and thank her personally for giving her closure. Rachel promised to pass along the message, and she thought about Lisa sitting in some office back on Earth, probably not fully understanding what her work had meant to thousands of beings across the galaxy, and she made a mental note to make sure that Lisa received proper recognition, not just from humanity, but from the galactic community as well. Vela called the chamber to order and said that the Council would now vote on humanity's status, and that based on the successful completion of the challenge, humans had earned the right to full membership with all standard privileges. And she asked if any delegate wished to object or propose modifications to this arrangement. The chamber remained silent, and not a single voice was raised in objection, and Rachel felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she blinked them away because she knew this moment was being recorded and transmitted across the galaxy, and she wanted to appear dignified and professional. The vote was called, and it was unanimous, and every single delegate voted to grant humanity full membership, and Vela made it official with a formal declaration, and Rachel became the first human ambassador with full voting rights and full access to Council resources and full participation in all committees and DHL subcommittees. But then Vela said something else, and she said that the Council had decided to grant humanity one additional honor beyond the standard membership package, and that they were creating a new permanent seat on the Security Council, and that this seat would be reserved for humanity in recognition of their unique contribution to galactic safety. Rachel was stunned because permanent seats on the Security Council were extremely rare and were only held by the most powerful and influential species, and there were only 12 permanent members out of thousands of Council members, and to be granted such status after just 3 months of membership was unprecedented. Commander Lisa explained the reasoning, and she said that the raider hunt had demonstrated that humanity had skills and perspectives that were valuable for security matters, and that the council needed people who could think like criminals and predators, because those were the kinds of threats that the galaxy faced, and humans had evolved as both hunters and prey, and had spent millennia competing with each other. And those experiences had created a unique understanding of conflict and strategy. The Gray Woman said that most council species were peaceful and had been peaceful for thousands of years, that they had forgotten what it was like to live in a dangerous universe where survival was not guaranteed, and that they had built their civilizations on cooperation and shared prosperity, and those were wonderful things, but they also created vulnerabilities, said that humans still remembered how to hunt, and how to hide, and how to fight, and how to survive in hostile environments, and that these skills might seem primitive or barbaric to some, but they were exactly what the council needed to protect the peaceful civilizations from threats like the Raiders. Rachel accepted the honor on behalf of humanity, and she said that humans would work hard to prove worthy of the trust that was being placed in them, and that they would use their Security Council seat responsibly and would try to learn from the wisdom and experience of the other members. Over the next few days, Rachel participated in dozens of meetings and briefings as she learned about her new responsibilities, and she met with other Security Council members and reviewed threat assessments and intelligence reports and learned about ongoing operations. And it was overwhelming but also exciting, because she was helping to shape galactic policy rather than just reacting to it. Jennifer called from Earth, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, and she said that the reaction back home was incredible, and that people were celebrating in the streets, and that humanity's confidence had been completely transformed, and that suddenly everyone wanted to be part of the space program, and applications for every kind of space-related job were flooding in from all over the world. The director said that Lisa had become a celebrity overnight, and that she was being interviewed by every major news organization, and that she seemed uncomfortable with the attention, but was handling it well, and that the government was planning to give her some kind of major award. But Lisa had said she just wanted to get back to work because there were other mysteries to solve. Asked about the reaction from other countries, and Jennifer said it was mostly positive, and that even nations that had been skeptical about space exploration were now investing heavily in their programs, and that there was a sense of unity and purpose that humanity had not felt in a long time, and that maybe this was the beginning of something important. But Jennifer also warned that success could be dangerous in its own way, and that humans might become overconfident and think they could solve every problem as easily as they had solved the Raider mystery, and that it was important to remember that they had been lucky, and that the next challenge might not play to their strengths. Rachel agreed, and she said that she was already seeing signs of this in some of the younger human diplomats who seemed to think that humanity was now equal to species that had been traveling the stars for millions of years, and that she would need to remind people regularly that they still had a lot to learn. Vela invited Rachel to a private meeting in her quarters, and Rachel accepted nervously because she did not know what to expect. And when she arrived, she found that the elf woman lived in a space that was beautiful, but also surprisingly simple, and there were plants that Rachel did not recognize, and artwork that seemed to shift and change as she looked at it, and books that were probably thousands of years old. The counselor offered Rachel something to drink, and it tasted like flowers and honey and starlight, and Rachel sipped it carefully while Vela settled into a chair that seemed to grow from the floor, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Rachel waited because she sensed that the elf woman had something important to say. Finally, Vela said that she wanted to apologize personally for the way humanity had been treated during their initial evaluation, that the council had been arrogant and dismissive, and had made judgments based on incomplete understanding, and that this was not the first time the council had made such mistakes, and probably would not be the last. Elf Woman explained that she was over 8,000 years old, that she had seen many young species join the council, and that most of them followed predictable patterns, and that they either adapted to galactic norms and became like everyone else, or they clung to their unique traits and remained isolated and marginalized. But Vela said that occasionally there was a species that found a third path, and that managed to maintain their unique identity while also integrating into the galactic community, and that contributed something genuinely new and valuable, rather than just copying what others had done before them. And she thought humanity might be one of those species. Rachel asked why the counselor thought this, and Vela said it was because of the way Rachel had handled herself during the challenge, and that instead of trying to become what the council expected, her to be Rachel had stayed true to human nature and had used human strengths even when they seemed inadequate compared to alien capabilities. Rachel spent the next several weeks settling into her new role as humanity's first full council member, and she attended committee meetings and voted on resolutions and participated in debates about everything from trade regulations to environmental protection standards, and she quickly learned that galactic politics was just as complicated and frustrating as politics back on Earth, except now there were thousands of different perspectives instead of just dozens. Also began building relationships with other delegates, and she found that many of them were genuinely curious about humanity and wanted to learn more about Earth and human culture, and she spent hours answering questions about everything from human reproduction to human cuisine to human music, and some of the questions were simple, and some were profound, and some were just plain strange. Commander Lysa became something of a friend, and the two of them met regularly to discuss security matters, and Rachel learned that the Grey Collective had been watching humanity for longer than she had realized, and that they had actually made contact several times over the centuries, but had kept it secret because they were not sure if humans were ready for the truth about the wider universe. The Grey Woman explained that her species had a long history of studying younger civilizations and trying to guide them toward peaceful development, and that they had succeeded with some species, but had also witnessed the self-destruction of others, and that they had been genuinely concerned that humanity might fall into the latter category. Lysa said that humans were unusual because they were simultaneously capable of extraordinary kindness and terrible cruelty, and that they could create beautiful art while also building weapons of mass destruction, and that they valued both cooperation and competition, and that this duality made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous. But the Grey Commander also said that after watching humans solve the Raider problem, she had started to think that maybe this duality was not a weakness but a strength, and that maybe humanity's ability to understand both peace and violence made them uniquely qualified to help maintain galactic security, because they could think like both the protectors and the predators. Rachel appreciated the honesty, and she admitted that humans were still figuring out who they wanted to be as a species, and that they had made terrible mistakes in their history, but were trying to learn from them and build something better. And she said that having a larger perspective and seeing how other species had developed might help humanity avoid some of the pitfalls that had trapped them in cycles of conflict. One day, Rachel received a message from a delegate named Kira, who represented a species called the Luminari, and they were beings who lived for thousands of years and had built one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. And Kira wanted to meet with Rachel to discuss something important, but would not say what it was over the communication channels. They met in a neutral location, which was a garden that had been designed to accommodate many different species, and there were areas with different atmospheres and gravities and temperatures, and Rachel found Kira in a section that was filled with bioluminescent plants that glowed in soft blues and greens. Kira was tall and elegant, with skin that seemed to shimmer like pearl and eyes that were the color of amber, and she moved with a grace that made Rachel feel clumsy by comparison. And when she spoke, her voice had a musical quality that made even simple words sound beautiful. Luminari delegate said that she had been impressed by humanity's performance during the Raider Challenge, and that she had been studying human history and culture and had found it fascinating, and that she wanted to propose a collaboration between their two species.